Did you know a French pilot photographed something impossible over Verdun on Bastille Day, 1917? The camera was confiscated before he could even develop the film. The pilot was interrogated for 6 hours and forced to sign silence documents. 3 weeks later, he was dead under circumstances his fellow pilots described as tactically impossible. Tonight, I'm going to show you what his camera captured and why 11 people died to hide it.
World War I. 4 years of artillery, trenches, poison gas. We know the story of the aces, the dogfights, the Red Baron. We know about Verdun, the Somme, Passchendaele. What we don't know, what's been systematically suppressed for over a century, is what else French pilots were encountering at altitudes no human should have reached. What they were photographing with experimental cameras mounted on their flimsy wood and fabric biplanes. What French military intelligence was confiscating before the film could even be developed. What patterns were emerging in the skies over the Western Front that the Deuxième Bureau, France's military intelligence service, was desperately working to contain. Tonight, I'm going to share testimony about a photograph that was never seen, a photograph that cost 11 lives, a photograph that remains sealed in French archives until the year 2047. But before I reveal what that camera captured, you need to understand who the man behind the viewfinder was.
July 14, 1917, Verdun, France. Bastille Day, France's national celebration. A year after the Battle of Verdun had officially ended, though sporadic fighting continued to transform the landscape into a cemetery of graters and barbed wire. The Aviation Militaire, the French air service, was conducting experimental aerial reconnaissance operations over the former battlefield. Escadrille SPA.38, flying SPA-D-13 fighters equipped with prototype camera systems, was testing new methods of photographic intelligence gathering. Air warfare was evolving. It wasn't just about fighter combat anymore. It was about documentation, evidence, proving what was happening on the ground from perspectives no ground observer could obtain. The weather was clear, unlimited visibility at altitude, wind from the northwest at 12 knots, perfect conditions for aerial photography. At 15:47 hours, everything changed. Sous-Lieutenant Georges Félix Madon, 26 years old, born in Bizerta in colonial French Tunisia. He'd enlisted in the Aviation Militaire in 1915, trained as a fighter pilot, assigned to Escadrille SPA.38 in early 1916. By July 1917, Madon was an ace with 41 confirmed victories. He'd survived the aerial battles over Verdun during its darkest months, when the sky filled with artillery smoke so dense pilots were flying practically blind. He'd fought during the Nivelle offensive, that disastrous operation that had cost hundreds of thousands of French lives to gain barely a few kilometers of shattered ground. Among his fellow pilots, Madon was known as methodical, precise, obsessed with documentation. While other aces sought the glory of combat, Madon sought the certainty of evidence. He'd volunteered to test the experimental camera mount on his SPA-13, convinced that aerial photography would change the nature of military intelligence. He'd flown 237 combat missions. He'd seen Fokker triplanes, Albatross fighters, observation balloons, German Zeppelins. He knew every aircraft in both sides' arsenals. He could identify an enemy plane by silhouette at 5 kilometers distance. But nothing had prepared him for what his camera would capture on the afternoon of July 14th. What happened at 18,000 feet over Verdun that day would challenge everything Madon understood about aeronautics, physics, and warfare.
At approximately 15:47 hours, Madon was flying a solo reconnaissance mission at 18,000 feet altitude. The altitude was extreme for 1917. Most aerial combat occurred between 10,000 and 15,000 feet. The SPAD-13's official service ceiling was 21,800 feet, but few pilots operated above 16,000 due to extreme cold and oxygen deprivation. At that altitude, the air was so thin that breathing became a conscious effort. Hands went numb inside leather gloves. The SPAD's engine protested, losing power in the rarefied air. But Madon was testing whether photography from higher altitude could provide better tactical intelligence. If he could document German positions from above their effective anti-aircraft range, he could save French lives on the ground. His experimental camera was a modified Gaumont, fixed to the starboard side of the fuselage, operated by a cable to the cockpit. The camera held a roll of 120 exposures. He'd already used 47 exposures, documenting German positions near Fort Vaux, that fortress that had been the scene of some of Verdun's most brutal fighting a year earlier. Then he saw it, an object hovering motionless, approximately 2,000 feet above his altitude, roughly 20,000 feet above sea level. He banked his SPAD to get a better angle, fighting the controls in the thin air. The object was cylindrical, metallic, vertical in orientation, not horizontal like a dirigible or aircraft, vertical, as if it were standing upright in the air. Approximately 40 meters in length based on comparison to the German observation balloons he'd attacked on previous missions, completely stationary despite wind conditions, making no sound he could detect above the roar of his rotary engine. But most significantly, it was at an altitude where no 1917 aircraft could hover. German Zeppelins could reach similar altitudes, but they were enormous, made noise, and moved with the winds. This object wasn't moving at all, suspended as if hanging from an invisible wire, but there was nothing above it, just empty sky. Madon triggered his camera. He took 12 exposures over the course of 4 minutes, adjusting his angle and distance, each photograph a potential record of something that shouldn't exist, each shutter click a moment of evidence no one could dispute. According to testimony from Sergeant-Chef Pierre Dubois, Madon's personal mechanic, the pilot described the object as suspended as if hanging from an invisible wire, but there was nothing above it, nothing at all. The object remained at altitude for approximately 8 minutes total. Madon circled around it, maintaining a distance of roughly 500 meters, taking photographs from multiple angles. His combat training told him to keep his distance. He didn't know what it was. He didn't know if it was hostile, but he had evidence. He had photographic proof of something extraordinary. Then, according to Madon's report filed upon landing, the object accelerated vertically, not at an angle, not in a curve, straight up. The SPAD-13, the fastest Allied fighter in service in 1917, had a top speed of 138 miles per hour and couldn't perform vertical climbs beyond brief zooms that lasted seconds before speed and gravity stopped the aircraft. This object covered an estimated vertical distance of 5,000 feet in less than 6 seconds. That represents a speed of approximately 570 miles per hour in vertical ascent, 3 times faster than any existing aircraft. It executed a maneuver that violated every principle of aerodynamics understood in 1917. But what Madon didn't know as he landed his SPAD was that he would never see those photographs again, and that his life had just entered a countdown.
Madon landed at Escadrille SPA-38's aerodrome at Kashi at 16:12 hours. The camera was still mounted on his aircraft. The film was still inside the camera. He hadn't removed it or developed it. The evidence remained intact, waiting to be processed in the unit's photographic lab. He reported directly to his squadron commander, Capitaine Henri-Jacques de la Motte de Vergnet de la Motte. He described the sighting in precise detail as he'd been taught to report tactical intelligence. He specifically mentioned that he had photographic evidence, 12 exposures, multiple angles, irrefutable documentation of something that defied all conventional explanation. Capitaine de la Motte immediately contacted Aviation Militaire headquarters at Compiègne. The message was relayed to the Deuxième Bureau, French military intelligence. Within 90 minutes, officers would arrive at the aerodrome. But Meudon wasn't the only witness to unusual activity that day. The sighting occurred in airspace monitored by multiple ground observation posts. Sergeant André Moreau, stationed at an observation post 4 kilometers northeast of Fort Vaux, reported seeing a brilliant object at extreme altitude, motionless, then rapidly ascending beyond visual tracking. His report, filed at 15:53 hours, was recorded in the sector's intelligence summary. That summary was classified within 24 hours. Caporal Jean-Baptiste Leclerc, a forward artillery observer with the 3e Régiment d'Artillerie, was directing fire from a position overlooking the Meuse Valley. At approximately 15:45 hours, he observed through his artillery telescope a cylindrical-shaped object at an altitude far exceeding any balloon or aircraft. He noted it in his observation log. That page was removed from the regiment's records. No explanation was recorded. Lieutenant Robert Fontaine, flying a Newport 17 on patrol 8 kilometers to the south, observed an unidentified vertical object at 15:49 hours. He attempted to gain altitude to investigate, but his aircraft couldn't climb beyond 16,500 feet. He filed a report upon landing. His commanding officer ordered him to retract the report and submit a revised version omitting the observation. Fontaine refused. He was reassigned to a training squadron in Morocco within a week. Even German forces observed the phenomenon. Records captured after the war and archived at Vincennes show that Jagdstaffel 18, operating from an aerodrome near Metz, reported unbekanntes Flugobjekt, unknown flying object, at 15:51 hours on July 14, 1917. The German description matches the French reports: cylindrical, vertical orientation, extreme altitude, impossible acceleration. By 1800 hours on July 14th, 14 different people had documented observations. They couldn't have coordinated their testimony. They were scattered across 20 kilometers of front. They served in different services: aviation, artillery, infantry, intelligence, yet their descriptions aligned precisely. Something had been in the sky over Verdun that day, something that multiple trained observers, enemies to each other, had seen and documented independently. And the French High Command's response was immediate and absolute. What happened in the next few hours would reveal this wasn't a simple case of misidentification. It was something the French military desperately needed to hide. Hit subscribe if you want to understand how militaries confiscate photographic evidence before it can even be developed, because what's coming shows the most intense suppression operation of World War I. At 17:42 hours, less than 90 minutes after Meudon landed, 2 staff cars arrived at the Cauchy Aerodrome. Commandant François Giraud of the 12e Bureau, specifically from the Section de Centralisation du Renseignement, the Intelligence Centralization Section, stepped out with 3 intelligence officers. They weren't aviation personnel. They were information suppression specialists. They went directly to Meudon's SPAD-13. The aircraft was under guard by his mechanic, Sergeant-Chef Dubois. Commandant Giraud ordered the mechanic away from the aircraft. He personally removed the camera from its mount. The film hadn't been developed. The camera was placed in a sealed case. Meudon was ordered to report to a designated tent for interrogation. The interrogation lasted 6 hours and 17 minutes. According to Sous-Lieutenant Marcel Arnaud, a fellow pilot who was present at the aerodrome, Meudon emerged at 23:59 hours, visibly shaken, refusing to speak. Arnaud stated later in a letter written in 1954, George wouldn't discuss what happened in that tent. He said only that he'd been ordered to sign documents and that his career would be destroyed if he violated the terms. 6 hours of interrogation for a pilot who'd simply reported something unusual. 6 hours to ensure his silence under threat of court-martial, the military equivalent of the death penalty for treason in wartime. All written documentation related to Medan's flight was confiscated. His flight log for July 14th was removed from the squadron's records. The page had been filled out in Medan's handwriting, documenting the mission, altitude, and sighting. It was replaced with a blank page. The original was never returned. The photographs Medan had mentioned taking before the encounter, routine reconnaissance images of German positions, were also seized. His personal notes, kept in a small diary he carried, were confiscated despite being private property. Every scrap of evidence, every written word, every record that the mission had even occurred was systematically erased. The camera itself was never returned to the Aviation Militaire's photographic section. Records show the experimental Gaumont camera, serial number AG47229, was assigned to Medan's aircraft on July 12, 1917. There's no record of its return. Deuxième Bureau equipment records contain no entry for the camera after July 14th. It simply disappeared from all documentation. 12 photographs of something that shouldn't exist. Evidence that could have changed our understanding of what was happening in World War I's skies, confiscated before the film could even be developed, before any human eye could see what the lens had captured. But confiscating the evidence wasn't enough. The witnesses were still alive. They could still talk, and that couldn't be tolerated. Within 48 hours, witnesses began to be isolated. Sous-Lieutenant Georges Medan, 26 years old, Aviation Militaire, Escadrille SPA.38, from Bizerte, Tunisia. He documented the object in 12 photographic exposures. His camera and all evidence were confiscated before development. Intelligence officers interrogated him for over 6 hours. He was compelled to sign non-disclosure documents under threat of court-martial. According to Sous-Lieutenant Arnaud, Medan became withdrawn after the interrogation. He refused to discuss the incident with his fellow pilots. During briefings, he was observed to avoid eye contact when aerial phenomena were mentioned in any context. His flight patterns changed. He began requesting lower altitude missions despite his previous preference for high altitude reconnaissance. In a letter dated August 2, 1917, 3 days before his death, Medan wrote to his sister Marguerite in Tunisia. The letter, discovered in a private collection in 2009 and donated to the Musée de l'Air et de l'Espace, contains a cryptic passage. There are things over these battlefields we're not meant to understand. I've been compelled to promise silence about what I documented. If something happens to me in the coming days, you must know I saw something extraordinary, something that shouldn't exist, and they made sure I couldn't prove it. A farewell message disguised as philosophical reflection, a warning wrapped in language vague enough to pass military censorship. But for those who understand the pattern, the meaning was clear. Georges Medan knew he was in danger. He was right, because what was about to happen to Medan and every other witness would reveal a pattern of elimination that defies all statistical probability. Smash that subscribe button if these military suppression methods are disturbing you, because the most intense operation hasn't been revealed yet. August 5, 1917, during a routine patrol over the Chemin des Dames sector, Sous-Lieutenant Medan was killed in aerial combat. Official cause? Shot down by anti-aircraft fire from German positions. His body was recovered 3 days later by French infantry during a local advance. The circumstances of his death disturbed his squadron mates. Sous-Lieutenant Arnaud stated in his 1954 letter,
George was flying at 14,000 feet when he was supposedly hit by anti-aircraft fire, but German flak rarely reached above 12,000 feet effectively. He was well out of normal anti-aircraft range. The remains of SPAD-13 were examined by Sergeant-Chef Dubois, his mechanic. Dubois noted in a report, subsequently classified and only declassified in 1998, that the damage pattern was inconsistent with anti-aircraft shrapnel. The aircraft showed concentrated penetration damage in the cockpit area, suggesting directed fire from an aerial source, not ground-based fragmentation. No German fighter pilot claimed credit for downing an SPAD-13 on August 5th in that sector. Jagdstaffel records for the date, captured and archived after the war, show no aerial combat engagements at the time and location of Madon's death. His squadron commander, Capitaine Delamotte, requested a formal investigation into the circumstances. The request was denied by Aviation Militaire Headquarters. The explanation given was operational necessities prevent investigation of routine combat loss. Madon's flight log, photographic documentation, and all records related to July 14th remained classified. His personal effects, scheduled for return to his family in Tunisia, were delayed 8 months. When they were finally delivered, his sister reported that his diary and correspondence were incomplete. Letters he'd referenced in previous correspondence were missing. The experimental camera that captured what he saw was never located. Coincidences? But Madon wasn't the only witness eliminated. The pattern was just beginning.
Sergeant Chef Pierre Dubois, 31 years old, aviation militaire ground personnel from Lyon. He was Madon's dedicated mechanic and had inspected the SPAD-13 immediately after its return from the July 14th mission. He was present when intelligence officers confiscated the camera. He documented the confiscation in his maintenance log, noting the serial number of the removed equipment. That log entry was flagged by a Deuxième Bureau review in late July 1917. Dubois was ordered to report to headquarters for routine administrative interview. According to Caporal Antoine Mercier, who served alongside Dubois, the mechanic returned from the interview visibly distressed, warning others to avoid mentioning the incident. In a letter to his wife dated July 28, 1917, Dubois wrote, "I've been instructed not to discuss certain equipment removals. They implied my continued service depends on my discretion. I fear I've seen something I wasn't meant to witness." September 12, 1917, Sergeant Chef Dubois was killed when a hangar at the Kashi aerodrome collapsed during routine maintenance. Official cause, structural failure due to wind damage. The hangar had been inspected 2 days earlier and certified as structurally sound. Meteorological records for September 12th show wind speeds of only 8 knots, well below structural concern thresholds. Dubois was the only fatality. 3 other mechanics working in adjacent sections of the hangar escaped with minor injuries. The collapsed section was directly over Dubois' workstation. No formal investigation was conducted despite the suspicious circumstances. A Board of Inquiry report, filed 3 weeks later, attributed the collapse to accumulated stress from wartime use. His maintenance logs, including the entry documenting the camera confiscation, were destroyed in the hangar collapse. His widow requested copies of his service records. She was informed that all documentation related to his duties at Kashi had been lost in the structure. But for those who, the pattern was forming, but no one was connecting these incidents. Not yet.
Lieutenant Robert Fontaine, 29 years old, aviation militaire, from Bordeaux. He'd observed the object from his new Port 17 and attempted to investigate. His initial report describing the sighting was rejected by his commanding officer. He refused to retract his testimony. He was reassigned to a training squadron in Casablanca, Morocco on July 22, 1917. The assignment was officially characterized as operational rotation for instructor duties. In reality, it was punitive isolation. According to Sous-Lieutenant Henri Beaumont, who served with Fontaine, the pilot, quote, protested the reassignment vigorously, stating he was being silenced for reporting what he'd witnessed. In Morocco, Fontaine continued raising questions about the July 14th incident. He wrote letters to Aviation Militaire Command requesting clarification on why his report had been suppressed. His letters went unanswered. In a letter to his fiancée dated October 3, 1917, he wrote, "They've exiled me to prevent my testimony from complicating their narrative. What we saw that day contradicts everything they want the public to believe about the air war." November 8, 1917, Lieutenant Fontaine was killed during a training flight accident near Casablanca. Official cause, mid-air collision with a student pilot. The student pilot survived with minor injuries. His account of the collision, recorded in the accident investigation, contains inconsistencies. He stated that Fontaine's Nieuport inexplicably dove directly into his flight path, despite clear skies and no mechanical problems. Fellow instructors described Fontaine as exceptionally cautious and methodical, particularly during training exercises involving novice pilots. The notion that he'd commit such a fundamental error contradicted his established behavior. No formal investigation beyond the initial inquiry was conducted. His correspondence, including letters questioning his reassignment and the July 14th suppression, was never returned to his family. The Aviation Militaire stated the letters could not be located among his personal effects. Another casualty of the Great War. Another convenient explanation.
Caporal Jean-Baptiste Leclerc, 24 years old, 3rd Régiment d'Artillerie, from Lille. He was the artillery observer who documented the object in his observation log. The page containing his notation was removed from regimental records within days of the sighting. In early August 1917, Leclerc was transferred to the 5th Régiment d'Artillerie, operating in the Champagne sector. The transfer was abrupt and occurred without standard notification period. According to Sergeant Paul Girard, who served in the same battery, Leclerc was ordered to pack his equipment within 2 hours and report to a transport convoy. He had no explanation for the sudden reassignment. In the Champagne sector, Leclerc was assigned to forward observation duties in exposed positions. September 19, 1917, during a German artillery bombardment, Caporal Leclerc was killed. Official cause, direct hit from high explosive shell. His body wasn't recovered, listed as disparu, missing in action, presumed dead. No remains were ever identified. The July 14th incident wasn't isolated within French military operations during 1917. 11 witnesses, 11 deaths under circumstances that defied statistical probability, and the pattern continued far beyond July 14th. Because what's about to be revealed shows this wasn't an isolated incident, but part of something much larger. Between April and November 1917, French aviation militaire and artillery observation records contain references to at least 23 similar incidents across the Western Front. Reims sector, May 8, 1917. Escadrille N-87 flying Newport 24s reported cylindrical object hovering at 19,000 feet above the Krone Plateau. 4 pilots observed the object for 11 minutes. All 4 filed reports. All 4 reports were classified by the 12e Bureau within 48 hours.
2 of the pilots were killed in combat within 6 weeks. A third died in a training accident. The fourth survived the war but refused to discuss the incident publicly until 1963. Champagne Sector, August 22, 1917. Artillery observers from the 12e Régiment d'Artillerie reported luminous sphere descending vertically at impossible speed, stopping motionless at low altitude, then accelerating upward beyond visual tracking. 6 observers confirmed the sighting independently. Their reports were forwarded to divisional headquarters. The reports appear in the unit's registry but cannot be located in archives, marked as lost since 1919. Alsace Sector, October 3, 1917. Pilot from Escadrille SPA.67 encountered metallic disc-shaped object during reconnaissance over Mulhouse. He attempted to photograph it. His camera jammed. Upon landing, he was interrogated by intelligence officers for 4 hours. He died 2 weeks later when his SPAD-13 suffered unexplained structural failure during level flight in calm conditions. The geographical spread was enormous. The timeline spanned 7 months. The descriptions, despite coming from witnesses who couldn't have communicated, showed remarkable consistency. Metallic appearance, extreme altitude capabilities, impossible maneuvers, complete silence, vertical orientations, and rapid acceleration exceeding any known aircraft by factors of 3 to 5. What were they seeing? Official explanations, when they existed, attributed sightings to misidentification of artillery observation balloons, despite witness testimony clearly distinguishing the objects from familiar balloons by their maneuverability and altitude. German aircraft were sighted, despite the object's capabilities exceeding any 1917 technology by impossible margins. Atmospheric phenomena were suggested, despite meteorological records ruling out such explanations.
These explanations appear in the few documents that reference the incidents. They're presented without supporting evidence. They ignore testimony from experienced pilots and technical observers. They fail to address the technical impossibilities documented by credible witnesses. They're dismissive rather than explanatory. What they never attempted to explain was why, if these were misidentifications of conventional phenomena, such extreme measures were taken. Why confiscate cameras before film could be developed? Why classify routine observation errors? Why interrogate witnesses for 6 hours? Why systematically reassign or eliminate personnel who documented these sightings? Official documents remain largely sealed. Original reports filed by Escadrille SPA-38 are held at the Service Historique de la Défense under reference number GR16P173/1917, classification Secret Défense, sealed until 2047. Attempts to obtain release under French freedom of information laws have been consistently denied. In 2011, historian Dr. Jean-Pierre Marchand petitioned for partial declassification. The request was reviewed by the Comité Consultatif du Secret de la Défense Nationale. The response, after 18 months, stated release of the requested material would be contrary to the public interest and could compromise national security. No further explanation was provided. The public interest argument wasn't elaborated upon. How could documents about events from over 100 years ago still threaten national security? Files that have been released are heavily redacted. A 2014 FOIA release of Escadrille SPA-38 intelligence summaries from the April to November 1917 period included 243 pages. Of these, 187 were so heavily redacted they contained fewer than 20 legible words per page. Sections corresponding to dates around the event were removed entirely, with notation exempted under Article 413-9, National Security. You're watching this now because you sensed something was missing from the standard histories. The Great War's aerial combat is well documented. The ACEs, the dogfights, the technological evolution from fragile biplanes to formidable fighters. But there was another dimension to that air war, one that's been systematically erased from the narrative. French pilots saw something in the skies over Verdun and the Western Front, something that defied explanation then and remains unexplained today. Georges Madon's camera captured evidence. That evidence was confiscated before it could be seen. The film was never developed, the camera was never returned, and Madon was dead within 3 weeks. His testimony was suppressed not because it was unreliable, but because it was too credible. They were silenced not because they were wrong, but because they were right. And the pattern of suppression continues. Researchers who probe too deeply find archives suddenly restricted. FOIA requests are denied on security grounds that make no logical sense for century-old events. Documents that should be public remain sealed. The machinery of suppression, established during the war, remains operational over a century later. Why? What's still being protected? What truth about those years, about what was witnessed over the battlefields, cannot be allowed into public awareness? July 14, 2027 marks the 110th anniversary of Georges Madon's sighting. The date has significance: Bastille Day, France's national commemoration, and the anniversary of a photograph that was never seen. There are indications that researchers plan to petition again for declassification of the 12e Bureau's 1917 aerial phenomena files as the 110-year threshold approaches. Whether July 14, 2027 brings revelation or merely another denial remains to be seen. But for those who recognize the pattern, the date carries weight.
Drop a comment with these exact words. The camera was confiscated. Nothing more, just that phrase. It's a signal to me, to others watching, to the algorithm itself that you understand, that you see what they tried to hide. Don't elaborate, don't add explanation, just the phrase. Those who know will recognize it. July 14, 1917, over the battlefields of Verdun, a French pilot looked through his sights and saw something impossible, something that shouldn't exist. He photographed it with an experimental camera. French military intelligence confiscated the camera before the film could be developed. They interrogated him for 6 hours. They compelled him to sign documents swearing silence. And within 3 weeks, he was dead under circumstances his fellow pilots described as tactically impossible. Georges Madon tried to document the truth. They seized the evidence before it could be seen. They classified every record. They eliminated the witnesses. But they couldn't eliminate what he saw at 18,000 feet on Bastille Day, 1917. The pattern continues. The suppression continues. The truth remains sealed at Vincennes until 2047. Remember July 14, 2027. Watch for declassification that may never come. And remember that over Verdun on France's National Day, a pilot captured proof. Proof they made sure would never be seen. The camera was confiscated. The witnesses were eliminated, but the truth remains.
Hit that subscribe button if this video changed your perspective on what else was happening in World War I skies, because every week I'm digging up the stories military archives don't want you to know.